The racist store manager swiped the woman's card and tossed it back at her. "This isn't going to work," he declared sharply, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't even look at her face as he spoke, his eyes focused solely on the card, as if it wasn't just the transaction, but the person holding it that bothered him. When the woman asked if something was wrong, his response was even colder. "Try another card." His words were loud enough for everyone in the store to hear, and his tone carried an unmistakable judgment. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't cower. Instead, she took a deep breath, standing tall, her composure unshaken. As she reached into her purse for another card, a subtle determination in her eyes made it clear. This wasn't just about paying for groceries. It was about standing her ground, refusing to let this moment be defined by the man in front of her, or the prejudice he thought he could hide. The silence in the store was deafening. And what happened next? It would send shockwaves through the community, becoming something far bigger than anyone had ever imagined. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. A black woman walked into the small local store, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. She had been there countless times before, always greeted by the same familiar faces, and always with a sense of comfort that comes from knowing the people around you. It was a quiet afternoon, the aisles not too crowded, and the usual hum of the store gave it that warm, homey feel. She moved through the aisles, picking out a few essentials for the week ahead: fresh fruits, some bread, and her go-to snack. Nothing unusual, nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. But when she approached the counter, the store manager was there, standing behind the register with an air of impatience. She had dealt with him before. His demeanor was always cold, and he didn't seem particularly friendly toward anyone. But today, something was different. As she placed her items on the counter, the manager barely looked at her, barely acknowledged her presence. His eyes only flickered toward her when he started scanning the items. When it came time to pay, she pulled out her card as usual, only to have the manager glance at it with a certain disdain in his eyes. "That's not going to work," he said, his voice gruff, not even bothering to make eye contact. Confused, she watched him swipe her card again, this time more forcefully. "No, it's not working. Try another one," he repeated, his words sharp and dismissive. She was startled. It wasn't like her card had ever been declined before. She looked at him, unsure of what to say. "Excuse me?" she asked, not understanding the sudden hostility in his tone. The manager barely looked up, almost as if he didn't care. "You heard me. Try another card." The woman, now feeling a growing unease, took a deep breath and reached into her bag to find another card, but the words that followed from the manager's mouth would take the situation to a whole new level. She stood there, holding the second card in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly from the growing tension. The store manager hadn't even looked at her as he swiped the card a second time, and this time, when it still didn't go through, he let out an exasperated sigh. "You should be more careful about your finances," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. His eyes never met hers. Instead, he stared at the machine, tapping the screen impatiently as though she were the one who had caused the problem. Her heart raced. The woman had used this very card just a few days ago, and there was no issue with it. Was something wrong? Was there a mistake on her end? She felt a deep sense of unease, but she didn't want to overreact. She tried to keep her voice steady, though it was harder than she expected. "I can assure you that my card is perfectly valid. I've used it all over town today." The manager's eyes finally flicked to her, but they were cold, almost dismissive. "Maybe you should check it again," he said, his tone now sharp, the words laced with a hidden hostility that made her uneasy. "Maybe your bank's decided not to deal with you." A knot twisted in her stomach. She'd heard rumors about the manager's attitude, especially toward people of color, but she never expected to experience it firsthand. As she reached for a third card from her wallet, She noticed a few customers nearby, their heads slowly turning toward the counter. It wasn't subtle. The tension in the air was thick. People were watching, and she could feel their eyes on her. One woman, standing a few feet away with a shopping cart full of items, narrowed her eyes. She whispered something to the man standing beside her, who immediately glanced in her direction, eyes filled with judgment. It was clear. Her discomfort wasn't just her own now. Everyone in the store was paying attention. The manager, seeing the growing crowd, seemed to sense the shift. He took a step back, trying to regain control of the situation, but his next words only made it worse. "If you can't afford your groceries, you shouldn't be shopping here," he said loudly enough for the entire store to hear. His voice was intentionally harsh, designed to humiliate. The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, but the anger bubbling up inside of her was growing too. How dare he talk to her like that in front of other customers? How dare he assume anything about her financial situation without even knowing her? She looked around at the onlookers. The murmur of voices was growing louder, and the air felt charged with discomfort. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "I'm just trying to pay for my groceries," she said, her voice shaking slightly but still clear. "There's no need for you to treat me like this." But the manager wasn't listening. Instead, he crossed his arms, a smug look on his face. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an icy stare. "Maybe you should take your business somewhere else," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't have time for this nonsense." The woman's mind raced. This wasn't just about a declined card anymore. This was about something much deeper, something personal, something bigger than a transaction at a grocery store. She could feel the weight of it in her chest, the heavy burden of unfair treatment, but she refused to back down. One of the other customers, a man who had been silently watching from the aisle, stepped forward. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes made it clear he wasn't happy with what he was seeing. A few others, too, began to murmur among themselves, sensing the injustice in the situation. She was no longer alone. The tension in the store had reached its boiling point, and the woman could feel it. People were starting to take sides. The store manager, sensing that the situation was slipping out of his control, reached for his phone and dialed the number he was all too familiar with. His finger hovered over the screen for a moment before he pressed the call button. "Yes, we have a problem here," he said, his voice cool and collected. "A customer is causing a scene, and we need someone to remove her." The woman, still holding her third card, felt her heart drop. She had never imagined this kind of escalation over something so trivial. It was supposed to be just a simple transaction. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare. As she waited for the police to arrive, she watched the manager stand by the counter, practically waiting for them, his eyes darting back to her with a look of triumph. The air felt heavier by the second as more customers in the store began to whisper amongst themselves, some openly eyeing the woman with suspicion. She knew that the manager's words would sway the officers, but she refused to be intimidated. She needed to stay calm, no matter what. A few minutes later, 2 uniformed officers entered the store, their presence immediately shifting the dynamic. The store manager, still standing by the counter, pointed in the woman's direction. He seemed almost eager to explain his side of the story, looking like he was about to give a well-rehearsed performance. "She's been causing a scene," the manager said, his tone just shy of a shout. "She's been refusing to leave, and I've asked her several times to leave the store. She's rude, confrontational, and now she's refusing to pay for her groceries." The woman, hearing his version of the events, felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over her. He was spinning a tale that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. One of the officers turned to her. "Is that true?" the officer asked, his voice lacking any warmth. "No," she replied, trying to stay composed, but the frustration was evident in her voice. "I was simply trying to pay for my groceries. He refused my card without any reason, and when I tried to explain, he just escalated the situation." The officer raised an eyebrow, seemingly skeptical. "So you're saying he was wrong to refuse your card?" he asked. "Yes, because I know my card works. I've used it multiple times today, and it was only after I tried to pay here that the issue happened. I didn't cause any disturbance until he started treating me this way." The manager, seizing the opportunity, chimed in. "I don't know what she's talking about. She's been loud and disruptive ever since I refused her payment. She's been trying to make a scene." The officer, still eyeing the woman, appeared to give more weight to the manager's account. "Well," the officer said slowly, "this is a store policy. If someone causes trouble, the store has the right to call for assistance, and if there's any disturbance, we have to act." The woman's chest tightened. It was clear that the officer wasn't really listening to her. His gaze was cold, distant, and not in the least bit understanding. Her words seemed to be falling on deaf ears, and she felt her frustration building. She took a step back. "I'm telling you the truth. I've done nothing wrong. I've been polite, and I've tried to pay for my things. This is just unfair." But her words didn't seem to matter anymore. The officer had already made up his mind. He stepped closer to her, speaking in a low voice. "You need to calm down. You're causing a scene, and if you don't cooperate, we'll have to take you in." The woman felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't believe it. She was being treated like a criminal for doing nothing wrong. It didn't matter that the whole situation had started with the manager's refusal to accept her card. Her protests, her dignity, meant nothing to the officer. Before she could say anything else, the officer took a step forward and placed his hand on her arm. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace," he announced. The woman's heart skipped a beat. "What? No, I didn't do anything," she protested, but her words seemed useless. The officer, ignoring her cries, started pulling her toward the door. The store manager stood back, watching with a sense of satisfaction on his face. Outside, the scene was unfolding as a crowd began to gather. The arrest was being filmed from several different angles, the sounds of phones clicking and recording spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The woman struggled, but the officer's grip on her was firm. She couldn't understand how this was happening. The truth, her truth, was being buried, and the injustice was on full display. As the officer led her out of the store, she glanced around at the growing crowd. People were watching, murmuring, and many were pulling out their phones. This wasn't just a store incident anymore. It was turning into something much larger. She could feel the weight of the moment, and despite the fear, she held her head high. The manager, standing just inside the store, watched the arrest unfold. The smug expression on his face made her stomach turn. He had won this battle, at least for now. As the officer led the woman out of the store, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She couldn't believe it had come to this. Her heart raced, but she refused to show fear. In the back of her mind, she clung to the one thing that still made sense: the truth. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just trying to pay for her groceries, and yet she was being treated like a criminal. The police car's door slammed shut behind her as the officer pushed her into the back seat. She sat still, her mind working quickly. Outside, the crowd continued to gather, their murmurs carrying over the noise of the parking lot. But then, something caught her eye. Amid the growing chaos, she spotted a young man standing near the entrance of the store. He was holding up his phone, his eyes locked on her. For a moment, she didn't understand why he was looking at her like that. But then, as the officer closed the door of the police car, he stepped forward, walking toward her with an urgency that caught her attention. He came up to the police car window, holding out his phone. "I filmed everything," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I got everything on camera. What happened to you? It's wrong. You need to see this." The woman's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone to step forward to help her. She was alone in this moment, or so she had thought. The young man looked at her with compassion, his eyes full of understanding. He wasn't just another bystander. He was someone who had witnessed the entire situation unfold and had decided to take action. He handed her the phone through the window. "Here, watch. This will show the truth." The woman took the phone with shaking hands. As the video began to play, her eyes widened. The footage showed everything: the manager's cold refusal to accept her card, the way his attitude had escalated, the officer's dismissive response, and finally, the moment when she was unjustly arrested. The video didn't lie. The evidence was clear. It was proof of everything she had been saying. For the first time since this nightmare began, the woman felt a wave of strength surge through her. This wasn't just her word against theirs anymore. She had something far more powerful now: the truth, captured on video for the world to see. The young man, standing outside the car, gave her a reassuring nod. "I'll help you make sure this gets out," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "You don't deserve this. We have to show the world what happened." The woman felt a rush of gratitude, but she also knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. This was about everyone who had ever been mistreated, everyone who had ever faced discrimination. As the minutes passed, more and more people gathered around the store, drawn by the noise and the sight of the police car. People began pulling out their phones and recording. Some whispered among themselves. Others began talking louder, questioning why this was happening. The woman could feel the shift in the atmosphere. People weren't just watching now. They were speaking up, even if it was in small murmurs. The tide was beginning to turn. The video, now shared by the young man, started to spread. First, it was a few shares. Then, it was hundreds. By the time the woman was transported to the police station, the video had gone viral. On social media, the story of a woman who had simply tried to pay for her groceries and was treated like a criminal was sparking outrage. Within hours, the video had reached thousands, then hundreds of thousands of viewers. The hashtags started to spread. #Justice for her, #racism in stores, #unfair treatment. People were angry. They couldn't believe what they had just watched. It wasn't just about the woman anymore. It was about the systemic issues that allowed this kind of treatment to happen in the first place. Media outlets, both local and national, picked up the story. The woman's phone began to ring with calls from journalists, news stations, and advocates. People from all over were calling, offering support, sharing their own stories of racial discrimination, and thanking her for speaking out. She was no longer just a victim. She had become a symbol of something much larger. Messages from people who had experienced similar treatment flooded her inbox. Women, men, and children from all walks of life reached out, saying they had gone through the same thing: being rejected, being dismissed, being made to feel like they didn't belong. But now, thanks to her, they had hope. They saw that standing up to injustice could actually make a difference. The woman sat in her cell, but for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She felt like her voice had been heard. Her strength, her determination to speak out, had sparked a movement. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever felt silenced, everyone who had ever been ignored. This unexpected turn had transformed the entire situation. The viral video had taken her story from a small local incident to a national conversation about race, fairness, and accountability. As the days passed, the store manager's name became associated with injustice, and his actions were dissected by the media. The officer who had arrested her faced intense scrutiny as well, and the young man, who had decided to record and share the truth, became a hero in his own right. The woman's story, despite the odds, had sparked something much bigger, a conversation that could not be ignored any longer. After the viral video spread, the backlash against the store manager was swift and overwhelming. People worldwide expressed their outrage, with many sharing personal stories of discrimination in retail. The hashtag #Justice for her quickly gained traction. and the woman became the face of a movement for racial equality. Her courage in standing up to the store manager inspired many to speak out about their own experiences with racial injustice. While the public rallied behind the woman, the store manager defended his actions, claiming he was just following policy. However, his explanation failed to satisfy the growing outrage. People pointed out that his behavior was not about store rules, it was about racial discrimination. Some customers vowed never to shop at the store again, and others demanded that the manager be fired. The store tried to quell the storm with a statement, but it backfired. As more news outlets picked up the story, the manager's past incidents of discriminatory behavior surfaced. The public wasn't satisfied with the store's half-hearted apology and called for immediate action. Protests began outside the store, with people demanding justice. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as the public called for accountability. In response to the mounting pressure, the store placed the manager on temporary leave and promised an internal investigation. Though this decision was seen as a step in the right direction, many felt it was not enough. They wanted real consequences for the manager's actions, not just an investigation. As the story continued to unfold, it was clear that the public wasn't backing down. The viral video had ignited a larger conversation about racial injustice, and the woman's strength had turned the store manager's actions into a global conversation about accountability and change. Amid the chaos surrounding the incident, something remarkable began to happen. The woman who had been wronged became a symbol of resilience and strength. Her courage inspired countless individuals to come forward, sharing their own stories of racial discrimination and standing up for their rights. But this wasn't just a moment of public outrage. It became a turning point in the way people viewed issues of race and fairness in society. As the public's anger grew, the store manager's fate was sealed. The store's management, under immense pressure, finally made the difficult decision to terminate him. This wasn't just about removing someone who had made a mistake, it was a statement. The message was clear. Discrimination would not be tolerated, especially in places of business where everyone should feel welcome and respected. The store issued a public apology, acknowledging the wrongdoing and vowing to take steps toward better training and diversity initiatives. But it wasn't just the store that needed to change. The incident opened up a broader conversation about how businesses, schools, and institutions need to reevaluate their practices and policies. People began demanding more accountability from companies, asking them to take a proactive stance against racism in all forms, whether overt or subtle. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of it all used her newfound platform to speak out for others. She wasn't just a victim of an unfortunate incident. She had turned into a powerful voice for justice. She shared her story at rallies, on social media, and in interviews, advocating for racial equality and standing up against prejudice wherever it existed. Through her actions, she demonstrated that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it can lead to real change. She encouraged others to find their voices and make a stand, reminding everyone that their courage could spark a movement. Her strength gave hope to those who had been silenced for too long. The woman became a beacon of hope for countless others, showing them that one voice could indeed make a difference. While the manager faced consequences for his actions, the woman found her own redemption in the form of her unshakable belief in equality and the power of standing up for what's right. In the weeks and months that followed, the woman continued to inspire others with her message of justice and fairness. She collaborated with various organizations to help further the fight against racial discrimination, using her voice to influence positive change in both local communities and beyond. Through it all, she remained humble, always emphasizing that the fight for justice was not over. But she had proved one thing. No matter how powerful someone might seem, the courage of a single individual can change the course of history. The story of the woman who stood up for her rights in the face of racial discrimination spread far beyond the local community. It became a symbol of how ordinary people, when they choose to speak out, can spark change that resonates on a much larger scale. The world watched as the store manager, once a figure of authority, fell from grace, but in the process, the community began to heal. People, inspired by the woman's bravery, started to engage in conversations about race, equality, and justice, ones that had often been avoided or silenced for far too long. While the woman's actions might have seemed small in the moment, just a simple rejection of an unfair treatment, the ripples that spread from that one act were far-reaching. The incident inspired others to find their own voices and stand up for themselves when they saw injustice. The movement grew, with more people standing tall, speaking up, and demanding the treatment they deserved. Her story didn't end with the firing of the store manager or the viral video. No, it marked the beginning of a journey that would continue for the rest of her life. Her efforts would inspire the next generation of leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens to challenge the status quo and fight for a world where equality was not just a dream, but a reality. As time passed, the woman saw the impact of her actions in real, tangible ways. Schools introduced more diverse curricula, employers began taking a closer look at their hiring practices, and more conversations around racial equity started to happen openly. It was clear that her story had created a shift in the culture, a shift that would take time, but one that was already changing lives. She continued to be a voice for those who felt they had none, using her platform to educate, share, and inspire others. She didn't want people to simply remember her for the incident at the store. She wanted her legacy to be one of change, unity, and understanding. Her work didn't stop with her own victory. She had opened doors for others. Her courage and strength had shown the world that no one was ever truly powerless. All it takes is one person to challenge the unfairness, to speak out, and to say, enough. With this mindset, she showed that change is not something that happens overnight, but it starts with the courage to act. The ripple effect continued, and what had started as one woman standing up for her rights became a larger movement. People everywhere began to speak out against the everyday injustices they faced. Those who had previously been silent now had the courage to raise their voices, knowing they weren't alone. And in that unity, change happened. Slowly, but surely. For the woman, it was never about revenge or recognition. It was about justice and fairness. She didn't set out to become a hero, she simply did what was right. But in the process, she became a beacon of hope, a source of inspiration, and a reminder that each one of us has the power to make a difference. She proved that one act of courage could change the course of a story, a community, and ultimately, the world.